being recorded. And then I will let everybody in, and Ashley can handle the rest. So as people are filing in, welcome to everybody that is joining us on this Wednesday afternoon for Controversy at Noon. We're going to talk about why buy Canadian, please buy Canadian, do you buy Canadian, so on and so forth. I've said so on and so forth like a lot this morning already, so I'm going to try to make that be the last time that I say that today. My name is Jason Norman, and I'm with the Writers Guild of Alberta, and I'm going to be the host today for this talk. So welcome to my guests, Jay and Hazel from Book Hug, and Laura from Literary Press Group, and Katie Lafreniere from University of Alberta, right? Is that?
Yes.
And so when we were talking before I started to hit record, we were talking about how the tariff kind of talk about tariffs in the United States and Mark Carney and the other guy was going off. There was a lot of talk about what that meant for Canadian publishers, the Canadian publishing industry, but also overall just in terms of just what Canadians valued when it came to the stuff that they bought and the stuff that they consumed. So we're not really going to talk about tariffs, but it is just the thing that maybe kind of got this conversation started. So Katie, the first thing that I wanted to ask you is, like, is this traditionally something that consumers, when they're making their decisions to buy anything, are they thinking about where it's made in terms of the local, and how big of a factor is that, like, all the time when people are making decisions when they're buying stuff?
Right. So it's kind of a loaded question because most consumers will say that buying local and buying Canadian is important to them. Like when we see these surveys, like at least 60% of consumers are saying, yes, it's important for me to buy local. But this doesn't always translate into purchasing because it's not the only factor that is important to consumers, right? We consider things like price, we consider quality, we'll consider who's the author, we're going to consider the genre, we're going to even consider like how far away is the bookstore from where I'm living. So highlighting that the product is Canadian, it helps, and it does explain, maybe it depends on the industry, up to 6 or 25% even of the purchase decisions that we make can be made depending on this kind of messaging that it's buying local. So it's one of those things that you want to add to your messaging, but it shouldn't be the most important message that you have, right? Like if you were creating a website for yourself, you would want to have maybe like proudly Canadian or the Canadian flag on your website, but it's not going to be like the top thing that's above the fold. That's the most important thing that they want. It's kind of like a part of the checklist that consumers are going through. So you want to have your most important stuff there first, and you want to make sure that Canadian messaging is there. It's just not, you don't want it to be like the only thing that is you're trying to use to sell your books or your product. Oh, you're muted.
Classic error. So during the discussion about tariffs, that was happening with other products, and like I was saying before we started to hit record, and I was talking about peanut butter, and like I'd made a decision that I was like, there's peanut butter that I like that is basically made in Tennessee, and then they bring it in, and a company that is like run in Canada sells it, but I was like, well, I'd rather just one that at least like made like squished the peanuts and made the stuff in Canada and then shipped it to the grocery store. And I said, well, I'm going to make that decision and I'll pay, I don't know if it's more, it's probably not less. But so when it comes to the decision making that consumers make, like just in general, what are the things that actually are like, we're talking about buying Canadian stuff, but what are the other decisions that people are just making in general when consumers are buying? It's like, you can start with staples, but just when they're making their purchasing decisions.
Well, maybe I undersold the importance of the proudly Canadian aspect, and there's a couple things I can speak to there, but the thing is with these, it's called the country of origin effect, if any of you guys like to get into the academic research part of it. But it really can be a signal of quality. And so it's one of the reasons why, again, you put it on the messaging, and because quality is, and this is important for like a wide range of products, not just books. Because that's so important, that's why you want to have it there at least as like the minimum on your checklist. Um, it's also kind of important because it sparks feeling of pride and it has memories of like what it is to be Canadian. And another thing is it tells the world what's important to you, like where we hang out in the world and the stuff that we, the clothes that we wear on the bodies, the books that we're carrying around with us to like wherever we're going to the coffee shop. All of that tells the world who we are and what's important to us. And so when it has those like Canadian signals, then it has this second purpose for us to be valuable. And so I guess when we're thinking about these like decisions of do we want to buy, like should I buy like the peanut butter because it's made in Canada versus not, um, those decisions will become more important during times like now where national pride is at a higher level. So there's always going to be some consumers that care about it a lot and some consumers that don't care about it very much. Right now, we have more people that care about it a lot. And Jason, based on the example you gave, you sound like someone that would care about it a little bit more than maybe other people. And so because of that, the messaging is always going to be useful and it's always going to be speaking to them. It's just the amount of people in that target group might expand or get smaller as these messages about like the 51st state and tariffs as they come up. Then we'll see it expand a bit more. And then as those messages go away, we might see it shrink a little bit more.
And like just quickly, like, so also in my example, so most people probably don't make their purchasing decisions based on like punitive, just like they're not saying I want to buy Pepsi because I hate Coke, or I don't like the owner of Coke. Like, do people, is that a thing? Is a negative kind of spiteful thing? Is that part of actually kind of decision making that happens?
It totally is. So
Oh,
consumers like to use their dollars to express their support or opposition, and this works for governments as well. So it's like boycotts, or they call boycotts, B-U-Y, boycotts. And so this can work even for non-Canadian populations. If we have people like non-Canadians that are even sympathetic to being like, why would they introduce tariffs? Why would they say that we're the 51st state? We might see actually an increase in purchases because of this proudly Canadian messaging, because of this nature that we have to use our dollars to express our support or opposition for businesses and for governments. And so the one thing I'll say though is just because we use we do tend to put our money where our mouth is, at least in some ways. Again, like if it's way out of our league and we're talking about the most luxurious book that I can't even afford to get anyway, then like it doesn't matter. But let's say all else being equal and it's something I want to buy and it's something I can afford to buy, um, then you can see these messagings comes to work. But I'll just say that one problem, and because you might then think like, well, let's specifically mention in our marketing efforts or in our advertising things like oh, the tariffs are bad or the 51st state. And I would not necessarily recommend to go that far with the messaging, because we as consumers, like we like to purchase things that give us pleasure and give us joy, and we like to think about nice things, and we want to think about things that are going to make our lives better. And because of that, we think about tariffs maybe because we have to, because we're kind of forced to. It's kind of like a begrudging thing for us to do. And so it's just one of those things that, so you have the messaging and it's not front and center. It's important to have on the web page or in that, but not as like the main selling point. But also you don't want to go even further and talk about like those negative things like tariffs. Like let the media bring those up, and those like cues will work to bring national pride to like a higher group of people in those moments, and it's going to like help in that way. But you don't necessarily want to say it yourself, because you want to make sure that you are like the solution to everyone's problems, that you're giving them the fond memories and like the sparked feelings of status and joy and national pride and that kind of thing.
Awesome. Thank you. That's a great place to start. So, Laura, let's go move let's talk about quality now. Let's and so cuz especially with how we started this conversation, the one nice thing about books is like basically all things are equal economically basically. Like books cost roughly the same. Maybe I'm starting in a bad place with the but like it's not like San Marzano tomatoes and like canned tomatoes from like it's we're not dealing with the same quality differences when we're talking about the book industry, but thinking about like the LPG, the literary press group, the publishers that you represent or the publishers that you work with, and on your website the kind of the talking about building a strong Canadian literary culture and what that means to you specifically, but also what it means to the groups that you represent.
Yeah, the elements of a strong literary ecosystem, I think you mentioned before, and that's certainly something that we are always trying to promote in a literary culture. Our members are 65 independently Canadian-owned independent presses. What that means, of course, is that they're not a branch plant of a multinational Big Five publisher. They are in communities across our country. They are contributing to economic activity in a number of different ways, and we've been trying to message that lately. But I think it's really critical to point out that they're essential cultural contributors too, and they discover new authors, they support the careers of authors. And I guess that's the way that a book is not like a jar of peanut butter, in that, Canadian publishers are interested in the wild diversity of our stories of various communities across this country, where um, a multinational publisher is less interested in artistic aims and taking a risk for a much smaller market. So, books are products of human creativity. Um, I think what we're talking about though is getting that message out and making the awareness of both the cultural import and the economic spin-off activity. Um, when you talk about Canadian made, we've been trying to get the message out that our members, there's sort of a checklist of things that you can look at for a book. You can say, is it Canadian authored or not? Um, is there a Canadian publishing workforce behind this book? There are very skilled people who edit, design, translate books, and our members employ them or they use freelancers who are here. Where is the book printed? Where is it warehoused? Who's distributing it? Our members check that box. It's all in Canada. And then finally, the money stays here, as you were mentioning earlier. It's not leaving the country to go to a head office somewhere else.
And I guess the other thing too, so thinking about obviously before the last 6 months or before the last year, like obviously saying that you're Canadian, saying that talking about this checklist to consumers of books in Canada was obviously part of what you did, but maybe it's been spotlighted lately. But
Mhm.
why has that always been an important thing? Like you kind of touched on it, but like how in terms of the marketing itself, because I guess I'm we're all kind of um we're kind of singing from the same hymnal situation. Like I know why buying Canadian books is important. I know
Yeah.
why, but do when it comes to once again consumers making their decisions, how do you find that they're making those decisions when it comes to those specific things, and how much is does it move the needle?
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions, and the biggest challenge I think for Canadian-owned publishers is um, helping people there is an awareness gap. How do we help them understand? Many general readers are not familiar with the press, the publisher behind a book, and we would like them to be more familiar with that for sure. We've seen examples of some independent bookstores doing wonderful things lately to highlight Canadian-owned presses, partly because of this moment, because their customers are actually asking, where's this book printed? Who wrote it? Um, of course, as Katie alluded to earlier, books are not cans of tuna. There's a genre that they're interested in. They're going to stay in their genre. There might be an author that they're aware of. But I think the big thing is this is not a take your medicine, buy a Canadian book kind of a message. are you aware that there's this vital diversity of expression and artistic creation in this country? And here are all the various things: poetry, drama, graphic novels, kids' books, fiction, creative nonfiction. And these are Canadian producers making this stuff, and they invest in those stories or those poems or whatever it is. And it ties to curriculum too. Like, you want our students to have Canadian sourced specific materials to learn from. And so I think there's just a lot of awareness building to do, and some people are aware, and it's growing.
I had to make notes for later. Jay and Hazel, Book Hug Press, you on your website, you talk about being radically optimistic publishers or people or both. So from the perspective of one single publisher in Canada, the things that you're hearing is this a full head nod, or is there something else to add that is more granular in terms of the experience that you have and why you do what you do?
That's an excellent
Yeah,
question.
great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're one piece of like a very large and broad and wide and deep landscape of publishing and cultural activity that goes on in the literary world. And Canada is like a super interesting place. Like, if we're going to talk about being a publisher like us, we're actually doing two things. We are definitely involved in what I would call a cultural economy. We are contributing to that economy through the work that we're publishing, but we're also a business. So we have to walk this kind of fine line of providing a cultural product for consumers, and also, bottom line stuff, wanting to make a profit from that, wanting to support our authors through the sale of their books. And the other thing that we haven't really talked about a little bit has to do with the fact we also export our books. We are not just working within the Canadian economy, we're also working outside of it. We have a sales and distribution team in the US, for instance. And we do try to market our books. We sell rights to our books to international markets as well, right? So there is something very interesting about defining yourself as a Canadian in that way. I think, like, we've been told like right now is a very good moment to mark yourself as a Canadian publisher for the Canadian economy that we work in. But we've been sort of like, we've heard things about, through our US distributors, like, don't sell yourself too hard as a Canadian because we won't be that interested in the States. It'll be harder to sell your book, which is interesting because we also publish international authors as well. And we market those into the States, and they receive those very well. Like, if we publish a Danish author or a Norwegian author, those books are received quite well. So like there is something kind of curious about the definition of Canada, or even the definition of anything to do with like a nation is kind of a curious place.
But I would just go back very quickly just to kind of maybe.
Did I go off on a tangent?
Well, no, it's fine. No, not at all. I wanted to sort of go back to something that Laura certainly was speaking about in this moment right now, where we are, as one publisher in this larger ecosystem of the Canadian publishing industry. We have for a very long time been quite committed to trying to break down for the general readers out there who might not really have ever wondered, who published this book, or how did this book get published? Because often, of course, we're picking up books because maybe we know the author, or someone has recommended a title. But we for a long time have been trying to break down what we understand to be kind of a probably very confusing industry. Like, maybe our industry itself hasn't always done the best job of actually branding ourselves, and what we do. And I think that, to be fair, I think that's because we're really quietly in the background, always working on behalf of and in support of the authors that we represent. So I think somewhere along the line, we may have not always remembered to take the time to also just reinforce for people, like, what is it to be a Canadian publisher, and what does that mean exactly? So we've for a long time been trying to break that down, but this moment that we're in right now kind of it's really run at home, the need to do that, to just increase that awareness, to help educate not only the general public out there, but also our other stakeholders. Even booksellers have told us they're getting questions from their customer base, but they don't always know how to answer them either, how to talk to their customers about what a Canadian published book is. So we know we have our work cut out for us, all of us within the industry, but from our own little perch as one publisher in the ecosystem, it's something we're really trying to respond to in the best way we can. And that's maybe where our radical optimism comes from. We've always said that it requires a pretty healthy dose of radical optimism to be an independent publisher. But that might be especially true within a small domestic market of Canada that we work within.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think, the other thing that when I hear both of your answers is the discussion that we're having is you're not just a Canadian publisher making decisions like for Canadians. You're not providing a product just for Canadians. You're making decisions as Canadians. So you're
That's
still business people in Canada. You live in Canada. You either raise a family or you live and reside here and you do your business here. So you're still, all the things that you do is still as Canadian, which means that there is a Canadian perspective to that. So if that means publishing a Danish short story collection or a Norwegian translation or something like that, it's still not just about, and like what Laura said as well, this isn't still a situation about like, take your medicine, like please, like throw a Canadian book on your shelf. Like these things are really tough to get through. It's like you would put your books against any books by American or whatever. It's there's a larger kind of, obviously being an indie against bigger groups is part of it as well. But once again, it's still not just about the things that you're doing that is just because it's Canadian or just because. Jay, I was wondering. So I met you at a book conference and book fair in the United States, and there was few Canadian publishers there, but there were, and it was at prime time. It was like the end of March this
Yep.
year. It was prime 51st state time. And we started to talk about, your experience with that and also your experience at that specific fair. But if you could quickly talk about your experience being in America. You've done that before, being at this book fair, I think. But
Yep.
just when you're selling books, you're selling them to basically 95% of the people there are Americans that you're
Mhm.
selling your books to. How are you telling your story to them, and what are you putting forward to them when you're talking about the books? And then also, what was some of the response you got maybe just recently in this last trip?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've been doing export fairs like that for years now, like 10, 15 years we've been going. And this year was particularly interesting. Like it was, there was a lot of anxiety about actually going. We're really glad we did because we did drop down in and amongst, people that are interested in literature. There weren't any people there that were telling us to get out, like all that sort of stuff. We received like a lot of apologies actually when people found out that we were Canadian. People are very
Same,
concerned.
lots of, yeah.
Yeah, lots and lots. Like they're embarrassed about what's going on. The kind of animosity towards Canada from the administration there, they're not happy about it. So when we first got there, we were being a little incognito, perhaps. But then towards the end, we were putting up little Canadian flags on our booth, and people were recognizing us right away, and they wanted to talk with us. And some people actually started to talk and started weeping. It was really emotional, actually. And they did want to support what we were doing. So often we would sell a book, but every time we go, we always let people know that we're a Canadian publisher. Curiously, the first few times that I went, people thought I was an American publisher because the website that we use is .ca, so they assumed we were from California, as opposed to thinking we were from Canada. And somehow that kind of worked in our favor in the early days. But now we still have that sort of point of pride. We are a Canadian publisher. We are here to share our vision as a publisher, and the reception amongst colleagues there and amongst readers has been very positive.
That's great. Yeah, it was as a Canadian, and the joke about being like sorry, that kind of a thing. many people, the first thing that they did when they saw Canada was they said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." They're like, "I'm so sorry," about which was totally wild to be in the States and have people apologize.
It's true. Yeah.
Katie, so I saw, I think it's there's a taxi company in Edmonton, and on the back of the window it says, for every dollar you spend on a ride share, 40 cents leaves, either 40 cents leaves the country or 40 cents stays in the country. Just what is, when we're talking about some of this stuff, where we're talking about multinational, companies owning Canadian arms of publishers and things like that, what does that actually mean when they say that money is leaving the country? Like, what is the basic kind of idea there when we're talking about like money leaving the country?
Well, I guess that in that case, that would be the reflection of, yeah, so that there's that portion that goes to the driver who is Canadian, but the business and all the people that run the technology and run the app behind it are not Canadian. And so those salaries don't end up staying in Canada, and they don't end up becoming consumers in Canada that are continuing to drive our economy. And that would certainly be a source where people with higher national pride would think twice before they, like, if they, assuming, like, the two taxis are like about the same price, that they would pick one over the other. But
Yeah.
okay. So I
Go
just
ahead.
wanted to speak a little bit to what Jay and Hazel were saying about being Canadians in the United States, and how one thing with the country of origin research that seems to speak to this would be about how we all have stereotypes of what other countries represent, right? Like, we might have a stereotype that, like, Japanese people are good with technology, and that, like, French people are good with all things hedonic and pleasure and that kind of thing. And those stereotypes would then reflect into, like, what we think are, like, the experts in certain book genres and fields. And so we might find that, like, in some, like, a Canadian genre, it would be the question of, well, what are Canadians stereotyped from the perspective of Americans as being, like, good at? And from there, then it would be, you could see that some genres would be more successful than others. And it makes sense with, like, the Danish one doing well, because country of origin, that's a signal, a cue of, like, the exoticness of a book, right? And that's something that, if people want to, like, if they're more about variety seeking and those kinds of needs, that would become something that's more important to them. And so I guess just the one other thing that I would mention, and so you were talking about how it's important to, not say that you're Canadian and what it means to be a Canadian, but also it's important to say what we as a Canadian, how it benefits the consumer. So what does being a Canadian author, how does that benefit the American reader? And that would be something that also should come across in the messaging.
Yeah, that's great. That's great to think about. And like, I do wonder what outside buyers are thinking when they're thinking about purchasing from Canadian publishers, if they're just thinking about the author specifically and they're just like, I read this person somewhere else, I want to buy their book and this is who published it. Something that just came to me super quickly. Do you think so, Jay and Hazel and Laura, do you think that the representation of Canadian the other Canadian art forms, do you think that impacts how people see this specific, so like when people think of Canadian movies or Canadian television or Canadian music, do you think that any of those are impacting how they think about how Canadian books are? Laura, why don't you go first if you had something?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not versed in consumer research, so I can't really answer that. But I will say that there's a lot of interconnections between these disciplines, and like many films and TV shows are adapted from something that was first a book, and so we are intertwined. So some of that programming that they're offering to the world, to their subscribers, started life as a book. So if there's some kind of a synchronicity in how the public perceives it, it could be because there was a book behind it.
How oh, how do we want to jump on that? I get bear with me because I'm sort of thinking in live time here, but I'm just recalling that just a mere month or so ago, there was a day that was called Canadian Film Day, for anyone on the call who might have noted that. And what it basically meant was that, in cinemas all clear across the country, there were dedicated screens on this one day screening Canadian made, Canadian produced, Canadian written and directed films. And we had the opportunity to attend one screening here in Toronto, of a Raptors documentary, which if anyone sees it come out, please do see it. It's amazing. However, it really made us think, well, we don't have a Canadian Book Day. And in the moment it felt like, oh, that seems like at the outset of that thought, like that should be something easy to implement.
Yeah.
And yeah, we go back to that idea that, oh, but our industry is one that is little kind of known on a wider scale. And it kind of made me realize like Canadian film and television and music and stuff have actually, they're kind of ingrained in people's mind. Like I think as Canadians, we are largely aware of those industries, whether how much we consume of them, it might vary from person to person. But I think generally speaking, people are aware that those industries exist and do take from them what they will. But the publishing industry, I think, is still one that's like maybe not on everyone's immediate radar.
Yeah.
It might make something like a Canadian Book Day harder to actually kind of start, but it's been something that's really been on my mind of
And
late.
I think actually it might be harder in a literary genre because somehow film and music, somehow the sort of national identity of those things is easier to pinpoint. Whereas with literature, and I'm spitballing here too, right? But like I sort of think like Canadian identity as a culture, Canadian cultural identity is really difficult because it's a really large space with very few people in it. And it's one that's like of various geographical locations that make up something larger than the sum of their parts. And I think like other countries, like I mentioned Denmark earlier, that's a much smaller country. It's easier for them to crystallize a kind of identity of theirs that's much harder in a country like Canada. The US also, because of its melting pot kind of history, is also really good at sort of creating this sort of singular identity. Whereas like because we are much more open to other things and a broad swath of cultural everything. Multiculturalism is kind of where we're at, then it's much harder to actually identify anything and to pitch that product as a Canadian, you know. And we often find like when we go to Europe or something like that, they have an idea of what Canada is, but it's from the early 20th century. It's like the Group of Seven and you know what I mean? Like it's the colonial Canada that still is like in their minds there, whereas contemporary Canada is something very different. Anyway, that's
I'm not sure if we've answered your question at all,
No,
Jason.
I just thought well, I was just thinking that Canadian television and film was not always looked at having a certain quality to it. And then, for a while, and then things kind of broke through, and it was always like, well, if something becomes popular in the States, then it became like,
yeah.
so then the idea was that, but the idea was always, it made, when people thought of a Canadian film, they thought cheap. When they thought of a Canadian TV show, they thought cheap. So did some of that, do you think, that was kind of the
Oh, maybe.
idea, not to go off on that tangent, but like, I was going to let people know that are in the chat that have questions. I'm going to, at about 12:45, I'll start to look at the chat for questions that people have. But I want to talk about money soon. I can't wait to talk about money. But just taking what Jay said, and like Laura, I'm thinking about, so what Jay said is obviously totally right, and we're thinking about, it's hard to define Canada. We don't also, we don't need to define Canada. We don't need to define what it means to be Canadian, but we do probably want to keep trying to tell Canadian stories, because the alternative, which is kind of like one of the main through points of Canada in general, is that if Canada isn't here, then it's just the United States being bigger. And so do you personally, or once again, the groups that you represent, like, this has got to be top of mind, the idea that you have to keep telling these stories because someone else is going to do it for you, and then it's going to start to get either whitewashed or watered down, or because basically contributing to the conversation is probably the least that we can all be doing in terms of like whatever the Canadian project is.
Yeah, I think you raised some really great points. And I mean, to be clear, every book is a specific thing that gets sold. There's a whole marketing cycle that goes into it. There's a lot of creativity, cover design, and we haven't even talked about, the ecosystem for reviews, which is shrinking, and display space in stores. We know that when the books are on the stores, they do actually sell better. So it's not that somebody had an idea about the book, they're discovering them in the store. Discoverability is a huge piece of this. So I'm not sure, like on a title by title basis, it matters if we're saying, we are saying Canadian authored, Canadian printed, et cetera, for our members' programs. But on a title by title basis, as somebody's coming in to discover that book, I will note, though, to get to your point, I think, is that the Canadian Project, our cultural policy for years has invested in Canadian published books. And there's a reason for that. And it is because we're next door to the United States, and nobody, these US publishers are not going to invest, or European publishers, because some of the big five are owned by European firms, they're not going to invest in a specifically, small town story in Saskatchewan or Ontario or wherever. So our literature is important to our identity and to our culture. And there are multiple literatures, there's multiple communities represented, and we want that culture available. We're cultural producers. And so funding is part of the answer. And I will note too that we now have a new cabinet minister title change to Canadian identity and culture. And so I think you've put your finger on something about, how do we get people to understand the multiplicity of things that go into Canadianness?
So, when I watch, so we're going to talk about money now. So when I watch shows like Dragon's Den, you have these two people and they come on, or Shark Tank, and they go, hey, did you know that the napkin industry is a $1 trillion a year industry? And if we got just 1% of that with our new napkins, we would make blah, 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 blah. And you go, well, yeah, but like, just because the industry has that much money that comes out of it doesn't mean that just because you get into it, you will get a piece of that amount of money. If anyone's following me. So the Canadian books in 2024 was about $1 billion in sales. Sorry, not Canadian books. This is the part. Sales of books in Canada was $1 billion. It's about 50 million books. And that's just what was tracked. There's still like people selling books on the street and used books and things like that. But like, this is not, we're not living in a country where reading is not happening and buying books isn't happening. $1 billion seems like pretty good to me. It seems like it might be going up or trending and things like that. So this is based on the BookNet. As soon as I can go into the chat, I'm going to paste the little link I have to this. So they say 12% of print sales of books in Canada were books by Canadians. So your first reaction to that from the publishers, or even Katie too, your first reaction, does that seem small or really good, or what do you think?
Would you like us to go first, Katie, or would you like to start?
You can go.
Well, I think it's alarmingly low, and I think that it's very distressing to me, but I will add a further stat to yours from the publishing perspective, that of that alarmingly low number of 12% of books sold in this country being written by Canadians, approximately 5% of those sales are books that were published by Canadian publishers. So that's an even more startlingly low number. So we have a great number of people reading in this country, but somehow or other we have landed in a place where the majority of books sold in this country, read in this country, are not written by or published by Canadians. That's, I think,
And I
something
think
that
that's,
requires, just let me finish.
of course,
Well, quite a lot of reflection.
yeah. And all I was going to say is that Canada is actually the most saturated book market on the planet. We have and I'm talking about English Canada. Like we sort of forget sometimes that there's two markets here. But in English Canada, it's the most saturated book market in the world. You've got all the books coming up from the US, you've got all the books coming in from the UK and other English-speaking world places. And so it's mostly an export, I mean, an import market.
Mhm.
And then within that, you also have the presence of the branch plants, which yes, are hiring Canadians. There's Canadian editors that work there and marketers and all that kind of stuff. But the profits, as Laura said, they leave the country. They go to Germany, right? So that's that's sort of the world that we live in. And it's sort of interesting to try and unpack how we got here.
Either Laura or Katie, do you have a thought on that number?
Can I just jump in, Katie, before you do? I do have one thing that I just want to say, just to kind of amplify maybe the look at the stats, is how important Canadian-owned publishers are to writers, because of that admittedly small market share that we have, 5% of the market, 80% of the book, approximately 80% of the books published by Canadian authors in this country are published by independent Canadian presses. So, there's sort of like, there's a real interest among the presses in discovering Canadian writers and nurturing their careers and taking risks on those writers.
And I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Katie, as well, but if you had a thought on that random
Yeah.
number.
And I mean, it's hard for me to decide if it's a small number because frankly, I'd want to know it in terms of the proportion of books available. Like it could be that only like in these bookstore shelves that only 5% of the books are Canadian books. And then if we're making 12% of the sales, then actually that's a great number. And this is not to say that we shouldn't be working to have more Canadian publishers and to have like higher sales. Like, I mean, I am a business professor, but it's hard for me to gauge where that number lands without knowing like the proportion of all available books. But there's always space for improvement, especially in a competitive market.
When I look at this, so if I'm saying 12%, so then I'm saying 12 out of every 100 books sold in Canada were written by a Canadian. And based on the stats from that link, that means about 6 of those are books for kids, and about 4 of them would be nonfiction books, and about 2 of them would be fiction. So for the group that I work for, and the group and the people that are probably watching this or watching it later or listening to it later, these are all people that want to work in in a Canadian book industry. And these are people that will, if they are ever published, will be published by probably a small Canadian publisher, or a publisher in Canada, and that mostly their stat will contribute to that 12% if they are ever going to be a success in the industry. So if I was somebody that wanted to be successful in an industry, I would also probably support that industry as well. I guess that would be the thing that I would say. So like if I was going to school to try to be to be a radio personality or a television personality, I might buy TV. I might listen to the radio. You know what I mean? Like I would if I wanted to work in film, I would probably watch movies. So I think the reading part is there, but I think that if you want to contribute to this industry, probably helping to make it stronger. Now we're probably, once again, this is probably maybe preaching to the choir a little bit. Maybe these are the groups that are contributing to that 12%, but it's like feels to me it felt like a small number. I don't like, to me it felt crazy small. And then Laura's number kind of helps with that, because then you kind of say, look at all who's doing all the heavy lifting. There does feel like there's a big shadow looming from the big four, or whatever we're going to call them, that are Canadian publishers in name only sort of thing. And the idea that like we just had Independent Bookstore Day around here last month, and it was a big push to get people into independent bookstores. And then the independent bookstores, and I think Jay, we were talking about a little bit about this before, it's like they want the sales, they want people to come in because they themselves are Canadian owned and operated.
Mhm.
But if 90% of everything that they sell is going to Random House that's owned by a German consulting firms, so on and so, like, it's like, oh, I said I wasn't going to say so on and so forth. Like, we're trying to not work at odds with each other, and we need the Canadian, we need that. But it's like, so once again, this isn't about taking medicine. This is about just realizing what good is out there. Maybe there's some legwork that needs to be done on all sides, but it's just like, this is not a group of people looking for a handout. These are people that represent, people that are doing the heaviest lifting probably in the
Mhm.
Canadian publishing world. I do not want to shortchange the people that are looking for questions, so I'm going to go into the chat. And okay, first, if a Canadian publisher uses Amazon but knows the books are printed within Canada, is that acceptable? Oh, so they're talking about Canadian publisher maybe being like working with like on demand, using Amazon for on demand. So this might be, Laura, what we talked about before about non-traditional specifically. I mean, we're not trying to make, I guess, judgments on how people operate, but does anybody have a comment on that specific question? In terms of like using Amazon, but then if Amazon is employing.
Yeah, I saw that question earlier, and if it's about sort of a non-traditional publishing arrangement, I can't speak to that. But if it's about Amazon as a platform to sell books, yes, our members, that's just one of many channels that they can use to sell their books to customers. And there's arguments for and against it. All kinds of arguments about access and accessibility to people who, especially in rural areas. But I would just say, and there's some troubling aspects from a publisher's point of view about some of their practices at times, but yeah, they try to make these books discoverable and available to readers through every channel.
And if people have more questions, they can definitely put them in the chat. Katie, are there examples of, like, I'm just trying to think of industries where like industries that were not supported, that were not, maybe not even cultural industries, where things like ran dry, or things just business, and what that meant to like the actual identity of the, like, the countries of origin that these things came from. Like, I'm just trying to think about, are there examples of where that we could use to be like, if this industry is not supported, this is the alternative that could be down the road. If it happened to like Kobe beef, or I don't know, I'm just trying to think of like when you associate something with a place, and then that place and that thing stopped being made or sold, what happens to those areas? Maybe in small examples, or maybe there's bigger examples that I just don't know about.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but speaking of beef, it's like when Earl's Restaurant said that they won't just buy Alberta beef anymore, and it was like this huge uproar of like, we can't eat at Earl's if they don't support our like industry. And so it's ironic, because if they'd never had that messaging in the first place, probably no one would have cared. There's so many restaurants that don't even have that at all. But it's the fact that they're taking it away, and there's this the theory is reactance theory, where we just react to like of our like rights and our opportunities being taken away, that people are kind of going to. And so it's one of those things where, yeah, until it goes away, people might not like have that passion, but we hopefully would not get to the point where these kind of industries disappear. Does that help?
It does. I mean, it's probably not just because it's lunchtime, but the food, it's so easy to talk about the food stuff, because I also think in the food industry, I think with the cultural industry, it just feels like there is a way to do the same thing, because I think when local restaurants are talking about the food that they serve, and they talk about local, that message gets through to people so much more than it did probably 20 years ago. And they go,
Okay.
this cow is raised down the street, that like this cow came from Wetaskiwin, and the eggs came from Sylvan Lake, and the cheese was here. And you go, and in my brain I go, oh, that's great, it's from over there, and the farmer, and you can see it all. And then the owners of that store, or of that restaurant, live, what neighborhood they probably live in, which means that where they pay taxes, that their money goes back into their store, which means employing people, employing producers, and things like that. all of those things that I'm saying, you can say with the cultural industry. Laura talked about it before. It's not just, and I think Jay and Hazel did. It's not just Canadian producers of story. It's the Canadian printers it's the Canadian distributors, it's the Canadian editors, it's the Canadian illustrators, it's the Canadian da 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 da. Now, that message does not get through in that same way when people go, "Oh, buy your burgers from this place. It's local this and it's grass-fed that." It's like it doesn't get through. And I think part of that is because I think, the controversy at noon, part of it is I think that we are working in kind of cross purposes with, there are big publishers that are Canadian that can still say, well, support Canadian because it's Canadian, but that money is not, it's not that they're doing it in bad faith, but it's just that money is going to different places and it's supporting shareholders and it's not supporting people that they employ within Canada. So I just think that, to me, that's why it's so easy to use the food analogies, because I just feel like it works for them, and it works better than it used to, instead of like going to chain restaurants and people making better decisions about where the food that they consume comes from.
Yeah. So I see your point now, and I can speak to this. So as the example, if we take what we see in food industry and then we apply it into the book industry. So there's three examples here. One is Wagyu beef from Japan, right? And it all started with being a specific way that they like handled the cattle to make it so that the meat tasted a certain way, and it was a very like specific process. And because of that, Wagyu beef became like this huge thing, and you can't like try to replicate it in other parts of the world. And so that's just it's been remarkable that way. But then we see Kobe beef and we see Alberta beef. And the interesting things about those two in comparison to Wagyu beef is that they don't actually have the same processes. They're just about the region of where the cattle is done, but they don't actually treat the cattle a certain way to make it so that it's actually a competitive advantage and it's a better product. And so, but they've worked from a marketing perspective because they've gotten the customer to believe that there is a difference there. And so if we tie this back to the book industry, the question is like, well, what is the benefit to the customer that then can be translated into like with the Canadian icon? And that's where we're lacking right now, is we don't know like, okay, does this mean we're getting like a certain quality of this? Does this mean we're going to get like a certain story of this? We haven't really said what is like the advantage that comes from Canadian, aside from just supporting Canadians, which will work. And we kind of talked about that earlier in the show of when that works better or worse. But if we have this like very clear messaging, then we can do what we did with Alberta beef, what Kobe beef did with the book industry, and making it so that there's this like clear cue and tie where it's like, oh, so if I get this Canadian publisher, or even just Canadian publisher in general, that means I'm getting this type of product. And I'm not saying like higher quality, lower quality. It has to be more nuanced in terms of the attribute that we're saying is going to be specific. Maybe it won't probably work for Americans, but like maybe the exoticness, like the wild, the more environmental. I think these are all stereotypes that come with Canadian, with like if we're talking about consumers outside of Canada, stereotypes of Canada. And so if we can like put that into the mind of consumers, and whenever they're looking for that type of product, they would automatically know then, okay, I have to look for that Canadian symbol.
I think the irony about the Wagyu beef is that they like massage the cows, but they read it Leonard Cohen poetry, which is Canadian. So a lot of people didn't know that. I think the other thing is, Katie, that's a great answer. I think the only thing that feels largely different is it feels like with Canadian books, it feels like we can largely talk to, as much as sales and stuff exist outside of Canada, we can be talking to Canadians about this. And Alberta beef even was a thing where they're like, they really wanted those exports. They wanted to send it out. And that's why the other problems that happened with like Mad Cow and stuff like that, it was a big problem, because so many people outside of Alberta and Canada bought it. But here, based on that $1 billion number and things like that, there's a lot to work with within Canada. So call to action is probably a perfect way to end here. So I've got Alicia's question. What advice? We'll go around the Zoom. What advice would you all give for us writers as readers to help support the Canadian book industry? Is it shopping at indie bookstores, which is not always possible if you don't live in major cities? Telling friends about Canadian books, buying Canadian authors on Kobo or Amazon? What has the biggest financial impact, and maybe what has the biggest impact overall? Jay and Hazel, why don't we start with you?
Thank you for that question. That's an excellent question. I would say all of that and more.
You almost kind of answered your own question with the.
I think a lot of it about is dialogue, where we can start just discussing and dialoguing with one another and our friends and our networks about Canadian authors, and just challenging one another to think more. When we recently put out kind of a challenge, if you will, to consumers, that the next time you walk into a bookstore, or if you are in a locale that is where you are able to walk into a bricks and mortar store, is to seek out books published by Canadian publishers that are written by Canadian authors. Like, ask the bookstore where they are on their shelves. If they're not there, speak to them. Well, why is that? Why don't we have that kind of representation in our Canadian-owned bookstores? Where is that support, that infrastructure in place to ensure that all those books that have come to market, aren't they in the market, right? So, like, using our consumer powers to kind of get out there and start those dialogues with all of with the booksellers and the librarians and everything, to just see those books represented and available.
The because I think that the thing that a company like ours, the largest challenge that we have as a company is discoverability, right? Like, as I said before, for whatever reason, we've created this import market. We've created this market where the branch plants control most of the marketplace and stuff. And so we have to kind of like operate in the shadow of that in a really, which is a challenge. It's kind of like swimming upstream all the time. But the more, like, we try to do things like we include a list at the back of the credits. We include the credits of who designed the book, who, and I, we go to the movies all the time. How many people get up and leave the theater before they don't even watch the credits? And you see thousands of people's names on some of those movies that touched it in some way, that made it, right? And so we try in our own way to sort of like provide that transparency in our books as well, so that you can kind of see who's made it. But and I don't know, I'd like to think that maybe the public could start thinking publisher first. Like, I remember when I got into this industry, I was really interested in who are the other publishers, and I started to look for those publishers, and specifically, right? Like, when I first moved to Toronto, it was really exciting to discover Coachhouse Books. And I would go around and I'd look for their logo on spines, right? The little printing press that they have. And so I've always kind of approached a kind of publishing first kind of way. If there's a publisher that I really like, I trust them to select something that I think is going to be really interesting to read, and I tend to buy it and read it. So maybe just like a slight shift, that includes the publisher in some way would be good. Yeah.
Like people that seek out A24 movies. They're like,
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. There's a brand awareness that we are trying to build with our curated list of titles, and that all the other publishers in this country are doing as well. So, yeah.
Laura?
Yeah, I want to jump off those very excellent points. Every publisher has a sensibility. They have a unique publishing program. They're curating. And writers who are our audience today, often they're thinking of submitting their work to a publisher. And so they need to understand those publishers before, to make sure that it's a right fit. So every publisher has a website. They're on our website if you wanted to list lpg.ca members. But you can just look, go to the store or look online. And the publisher information is always in the details. In a physical book, you can open it up and see where it was printed, who published it. So you can look up those things. And I think writers are very motivated to do that anyway. And I hope they will, because they can then sort of discover, again, that word, this publisher's very doing cutting edge graphic novels. This publisher's, interested in queer lit. This publisher's interested in diaspora stories. And that will serve you well, both as readers and as writers.
I guess just as a like what would benefit them, and of course we're trying to think of like how can we get more people interested so that more people are creating these recommendations and asking for these publishers and books to come, is just in your messaging and when you're talking about it with other people or on social media or with your friends, whatever it is, it's just to take the perspective of the listener and like what's in it for them, what's benefiting them. Like, you know, maybe if I'm talking to Jason, yeah, the moral angle of like you should buy Canadian will work for him, but that won't necessarily work for another friend who just like maybe who's like super into cooking. Like, what are they going to learn by them buying this specific book? Oh, did you know that you could learn from this cookbook how to like cook, I don't know, bison? You know what I mean? Like try to think of like what's in it for them, and you're giving them what they're learned, what's going to be surprising to them. And that's the perspective that will make it so that they want to seek those out more. And then hopefully there's that like, you know, drop in the bucket spread effect. But it comes down to taking their perspective.
Yeah, still trying to think about what the consumer is looking for, and are they getting it from not just the, like you said, the nationalism kind of perspective of it. I always tell people, nobody asked me, but if you want, like when Meghan Markle's book comes out, go to the library and get it. And then when the new, I don't know, when the new Pashamala book comes out, go buy it at the bookstore. So like, you did a good job already. You can still read them. You can still read all the stuff you want from Penguin Random House. Just get it from the library. But that's my dumb 2 cents. Thank you everybody for coming today to listen to this chat. I think this was awesome. We're going to have the recording up on YouTube shortly and the podcast channels so people can listen to it and share it and stuff like that. Jay and Hazel and Laura and Katie, thank you so much. This was a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time, and yeah, thank you again. And I don't know. I just think it was a big, great chat. So thank you very much. I think it was super important, and thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you everyone for watching.
Thanks, Jason.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Jason.
writers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.